Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Long Form, the podcast produced by Jadaliyya. Our inspiration for these discussions is the well known quote by Antonio Gramsci: "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." I'm Bassam Haddad, and together with my guest co host Adel Iskandar, we are exploring this theme with a series of guests whose work has produced and provided valuable insights into these issues. For this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with three prominent media personalities, scholars, experts, and producers: Laila Al-Arian, Assal Rad, and Sana Saeed. Apologies for any mispronunciations. Their bios are previewed in the Jadaliyya post and at the outset of this program. It would take literally like a good portion of the show if we leave them out. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Sana, Asal, and Layla. And of course, Adil. All right. I would like us to just continue, since this is the first long form with more than one person, to continue with the theme, which is sort of the context within which these discussions are taking place. And that is, are we witnessing a change in the global order at various levels or at any of the levels, or are we basically witnessing business as usual? In other words, after this genocide and a number of other processes that we are witnessing globally, is this a potential turning point, or is it just another set of challenges and problems that we will have to live with as we return to business as usual? Um, Let me assert that this will be about reporting, politics, and the media. And we want to start with a broad set of questions that I'll ask, and I'll give everyone an opportunity to respond, and then we will tackle specific questions. At this point, as we have seen in the past couple of months since the inauguration of the new president, President Trump, there is a Democratic Party odd shift of sorts. And of course, it's like a superficial shift on Palestine that suggests some rifts, openings, and so on the question, on the topic of Palestine. And there is an unusual outrage uh, at the genocide unfolding in Gaza, or at the ethnic cleansing plans discussed about Gaza. We witnessed a very slow but notable transition from the liberal mainstream media, notable in some cases, not in all cases, usually pegged on the Democratic Party politics, from being essentially quiet or outright complicit with Israel's genocide or ethnic cleansing during the Biden presidency, to now, under Trump, where a number of people, notably media personalities, but also some politicians, speaking out here and there about Trump's proposed ethnic cleansing of Gaza and related matters. Clearly, not on principle. Still, in the final analysis, the complicity continues to be ubiquitous throughout the political spectrum in the United States. I will ask these couple of questions of our guests, and hopefully, each of you can have an opportunity to respond, and then Adil will take things to other more specific matters. So, the first question is: how are the Democratic Party's powers that be understanding and interpreting Trump's positions on Gaza, whether in mundane political terms or in terms of how this is being reported or communicated? And second, has anything changed about the mainstream media's coverage of the genocide now versus during the previous period? Is there anything notable, anything changing? And of course, as I shared earlier, feel free to address the broader question of whether we are witnessing a shift or of sorts, generally speaking, that will take effect after this genocide, or are we simply going to go back to business as usual? So let's start with Layla, and then Asal, and then Sana, so that people know how to proceed without.
Well, I think it's important to make a distinction between Democratic Party leadership, the elected politicians, the people who actually run the party, and people within the Democratic Party. So people who kind of self identify as Democrats. I think you saw a huge division within the party itself when you're just talking about people, Democratic voters. When it comes to Gaza, for a long time, ever since the beginning of the genocide, you saw this obviously factor into the election. You saw for months and months and months people warning the Democratic Party, if you don't shift on this issue, you are going to lose. You are going to lose major parts of your party. You are going to lose your credibility, your legitimacy, any sense that you have any moral authority on any global issue, on human rights. And you saw the Democratic Party again and again choose genocide, choose supporting and facilitating Israel's genocide of Gaza over actually even what they say was this, risk to democracy in the form of Donald Trump. So they chose supporting Israel over protecting the country from Donald Trump, which was their message all along. So in terms of what we've seen, there is a shift in terms of some people within the Democratic Party who self-identify as Democrats. I would say those are the people who perhaps we saw those videos during the DNC when protesters would really be pushing the Democratic Party to do better. They were sort of turning their noses up and sort of cursing at the protesters and walking away. I would say those people, by and large, their rhetoric has been gloating when it comes to Trump's rhetoric on ethnic cleansing, when it comes to even the genocide resuming, saying, hey, Dearborn, are you happy now? This is what you've gotten. So you see some of that. You saw kind of a sustained campaign at some point where they were blaming Arab American or anti-genocide voters on Trump's ethnic cleansing plan. It's almost like they were more offended that these voters didn't vote for Harris than the ethnic cleansing itself. So you saw them really overly focusing on that and using it as a political punching bag. But then you see kind of business as usual when it comes to the Democratic Party leadership. So we recently saw an interview that Senator Chuck Schumer gave to the New York Times where he repeated every major pro-Israel trope and justification of the genocide, saying that it's not a genocide because Israel did not try to kill, a people in part or in whole, as the definition of genocide is. And that's despite actually the consensus of scholars of genocide who say that it is a genocide, who've been saying this for a very long time. He also repeated tropes that Hamas uses human shields, that it's actually the fault of Palestinians that their civilians are being killed. So you see some of the same rhetoric that we've heard all along during the Harris-Biden administration being repeated now in support of Israel. And you saw Schumer also not having a lot of daylight with Republicans when it comes to Mahmoud Khalil's case. So a lot of what he said, the Columbia graduate student who's also a permanent resident who's arrested, he said, I deplore his views without even mentioning what those views were. There was stating as fact that there was anti-Semitism happening at Columbia, even rebuking Columbia when the news came out that the Trump administration, withdrew $400 million from the university, and even said that Jewish students are, quote, victims of those protests, as if there weren't Jewish students who were part of the protests. So I don't see a huge shift within the Democratic Party leadership itself, since Trump took office.
Did you want me to?
Assal, yeah, if you don't mind.
I mean, I would largely agree with that, right? The Democratic Party the Democratic Party is a mess, I would say. It's not just that it's not responding to Gaza, it's not responding to anything. It's just sort of sitting there letting, not letting, that makes it sound passive to say like they're just letting these things happen. Actually, they paved the way for these things to happen, and that's the way that it should be described and understood. When you talk about, for instance, the case of Mahmoud Khalil, the only reason why we're in a context where you can have someone like him targeted is because student protesters were already painted as villains by the Biden administration. He talked about restoring order from chaos. He described them as being anti-Semitic. He described them as being violent. He was the president when students were being expelled, suspended, arrested on campus, when you saw that campus crackdown that was happening. So, or if you look at Gaza, right, they talk about, Trump's ethnic cleansing plan. It certainly is, and the media won't call it that. But guess who paved the way for that plan? When Trump says Gaza is destroyed, he's right. He's not incorrect. When he says it is uninhabitable, he's correct. But who made it that way? People were talking about it during the entire genocide. The criticism that was going towards the Democrats and the Biden administration was, you are overseeing a genocide where Israel is deliberately destroying Gaza in order to make the case that, well, they can't live here anymore. Palestinians can't live here anymore. This place is uninhabitable. That was the intention all along. And so when Trump says any of these things now, all of that was created. The conditions for which he can carry out, or at least rhetorically talk about these things in this fashion, was created by the Democrats. Not to mention the fact that the Democrats didn't address any of the issues that voters had, including everything that we're talking about, but you can talk about domestic issues as well, in order to prevent him from getting elected in the first place. He's elected because they didn't address so many of the issues that their constituents had. And I think the reason I say the Democratic Party is an absolute mess is what you can, which I do, you can criticize and condemn what the Republicans under the Trump administration are doing. But here's the very interesting thing. They are doing what their voters wanted them to do. Now, we can disagree with it. We can say it's unconstitutional. We can condemn it. He is at least doing the things he said he was going to do based on what his own base wanted. What the Democrats did is ignore their base, reject it, condescend at their own voters in order to appeal to Trump voters, which is clearly a tactic that didn't work because that's why they miserably failed in the elections. And there hasn't seemed to be a real attempt at reflecting on that and addressing those issues. Instead, as Laila pointed out, I mean, they've largely maintained the same kind of rhetoric. And, I know, Bassam, part of your question was also about the media landscape. I would say the media landscape similarly, the only real criticisms that you're seeing, whether it's the media or Democrats, is of Trump's character, his decorum, the way he does things, right? Like, I can't believe he shared this ridiculous AI-generated video. They can believe the war crimes, they can believe the genocide, they can believe the ethnic cleansing. All of that is fine. They can believe deportations of permanent legal US residents, of green card holders. All of that is fine. But they can't believe the way that he sometimes does it, how he posts it or how he talks about it. So the criticisms, if there's any kind of pivot that I've seen at least, and maybe I'm being negative and I would love to hear that there's been some kind of concrete shift, but the only difference I really see is that there's more criticism of the person in the White House than you saw before. There was no criticism of Joe Biden. Even though he dehumanized Palestinians, even though he engaged in genocide denial, even though he committed genocide, there was no criticism of Joe Biden. Joe Biden was a decent man. Trump you can attack, but the policies and that status quo is maintained.
I'm like echoing everything that was just said by Assal and Laila, and Assal was like, maybe someone else can be a bit more positive. There is maybe a positive lining. It won't be me because like half of my own life has been kind of spent with these moments of like, oh, the tide is changing, right? Whether it's in the media, I mean, even in 2021, I remember a lot of us in our newsroom, we saw these like during the Israeli assault on Gaza, then we saw these like, oh, they have Mohammed Al-Kurd on this show. Oh, John Oliver is talking about this. Oh, there's like Eli Velshi on MSNBC is saying this about, he's calling it apartheid. The tide is shifting. But since October 2023 in particular, I am very strongly in the camp that no, of course there isn't going to be a significant shift in the actual structures of media and political power, right? And that doesn't mean that there isn't a shift among Americans. And, as Laila also pointed out, like we know there is. We know that, for instance, the Democrats' refusal to end the genocide, to end the Biden-Harris administration's genocide, that Harris's refusal to distance herself from Biden, which we now know is because Biden threatened his support for her if she did distance herself at all in terms of especially the Israel policy. And he specifically used the term, he said to her, "No daylight, kid," which is the daylight term is actually an AIPAC term, right? That there should be no daylight between the United States and Israel in their relationship. So we know that 29% of people who had voted for Biden in 2020 refused to vote for Harris specifically because of the Biden administration's oversight of the genocide of Palestinians. And this was according to a poll by IMEU and YouGov. As it's also mentioned, the Democrats are not doing anything. They're really not. Yes, we had this like little bit of a flash moment where, Trump basically said, the criticisms towards Trump, like it was mentioned, are about his character and what he says. But the problem is never really ultimately even with the policy. Trump said something that's been in motion with regards to US and Israeli policy since especially October 2023. We knew on October 10th that the Israelis had every intention and plan to physically displace and force the Palestinians out of Gaza and into, at that time, according to the leaked papers, right, into the Egyptian Sinai. So when Trump goes out and he's like, well, I want to empty out Gaza, we're going to make it into the Riviera of the Middle East, this and that, et cetera. And these Democrats come out and they're like, oh my God, this is horrible. We had 144, Democratic lawmakers sign a statement saying this is just unconscionable. This is a war crime. All of a sudden they discover the word war crime. All of a sudden the New York Times is talking about international law in their headlines. And all of this is, of course, a facade. Like I really always caution people to not get too excited about these things just because we see a little turn away from the usual kind of genocide manufacturing does not mean that we're seeing a massive shift in the actual structure of media and politics itself. The Democrats need to maintain that facade of opposition to Trump, right? They're not actually doing anything in any significant way to oppose anything he said or done. And they did the same thing, with regards to, Assal mentioned that, that they're not doing anything for their base. They weren't doing this when they were even in the office, right? We saw several states, for instance, across the United States who were introducing anti-LGBTQ legislation, which is an issue that is very important to the Democratic base. What did the Biden and Harris administration do? Even in terms of just putting out statements, right? When they were campaigning, as it was mentioned, they were catering to this non-existent voter who was obsessed with Liz Cheney. So it's, to me, I always want to make sure that we're exercising caution whenever we're talking about the changing tide. Are their attitudes changing, again, at the level of the institutions of this country? Because these institutions, whether it's our news media industry, whether it's the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, they exist specifically to serve the bigger institution of American power, whether that's domestic policy or foreign policy.
Thanks, everyone. Sana, you had written a very quick question before Adel takes over. You had written an article in Mondoweiss about that democratic sort of perhaps momentary and certainly instrumental uh, shift in how they started talking about the genocide and ethnic cleansing, and they were completely silent before. Do you want to say something about that piece?
Yeah, in that piece, I look at not just the news media and the Democrats, but also like entertainment. Was talking about like Seth Meyers, for instance. I mean, I don't watch late night TV, but watching clips of what he had to say about, for instance, Biden versus what he had to say about Trump. And again, it's like all of a sudden, right? All of these bulwarks of liberal media establishment. I know we're going to talk about like what that even means, liberal media, but all of a sudden they discover this language. Oh, and ethnic cleansing. Of course, genocide still doesn't exist, right? That's not in their repertoire. We're not going to hear that word from them. but the term ethnic cleansing for them is very easy to use. I think it was really interesting to see, like, there were even like media or like newsroom editorial boards. Some of them even had headlines about there being, ethnic cleansing on the horizon, this and that. And again, they do this specifically because they can't actually oppose the real policies that are happening. Like, we're essentially being told that you need to condemn, that we are condemning, right? This is what the liberal establishment is condemning, that we need to fear something that the current president has not yet done, more than we need to condemn what the previous president has done, right? We're told that the physical displacement of a nation is worse than the eradication, the extermination of that nation. That is what even that little moment, that little like a bit of outrage shown by the Democrats, by the liberal establishment in pop culture and news culture, whatever, is literally asking people to be more outraged of. Where were all these? And when I see someone like I saw people really applauding Representative Congressman Al Green for his he goes off for, I think it was like an hour or something, talking about the ethnic cleansing, and it's very moving. But it's like, where was that when it was your guy in office? Which again, all it shows is that the issue is not about actual policy. It's just who's talking about it. And even then, like, where are the, it's already been mentioned, but where are the Democrats right now with all their big, shows of outrage with 700, it's estimated over 700 people were killed in Gaza after Israel broke again the ceasefire within a matter of 50 hours. Over 700 people killed, Palestinians. We've seen an endless stream of children, of babies slaughtered. Where's the outrage? I'm being told to be more outraged about an AI-generated wet dream that Donald Trump happens to publish on his, Truth Social. I have to be more outraged about that than about seeing a stream of slaughtered Palestinian children who've been killed by bombs that my tax dollars paid for, by bombs that my lawmakers are supporting. Because the thing is, the Democrats support that. They absolutely support that. They can't oppose that. The only thing that they can actually oppose when it comes to this is something that Trump will say he will do with regards to like physical displacement, and that's it. Beyond that, they have to co-sign everything because they've already co-signed the extermination of Palestinians because they've overseen it.
Thank you so much.
I was going to say, nothing brings the two parties together like a complete and utter callousness towards Palestinian life. I think that is the one issue that they could agree on pretty uniformly. And you see that when, like as Sana mentioned so eloquently, they're more upset over an AI video about displacement than actual human lives. And when they say things like, well, Trump is just gonna, or you're just gonna let Trump finish the job, behind those statements, it doesn't feel like there's an actual real concern for human life. It's just used as a political cudgel, as a way to get Trump, than to show any real concern for those lives.
Well, I was just going to add, the
Yeah.
only thing they actually argue about when it comes to Israel is who's the more devout Zionist. That's pretty much the line of the argument. If you look at the one maybe difference in terms of policy would be the way that the first Trump admin and then likely this administration is going to talk about the West Bank and settlements in the West Bank, or the occupation of the Golan Heights, like things that have been internationally recognized as Israel's occupation of Syrian and Palestinian territory. Republican and Democratic administrations have repeatedly fallen into line there. Now that they haven't actually enacted any policies that would prevent the expansion of those settlements, but at least rhetorically they would say, well, yes, according to international law, these are occupied territories. Trump admin came in 2016 and decided, no, anything Israel occupies belongs to Israel. What was interesting about the Biden admin, as at least on the Golan Heights, they didn't change positions. They didn't go back and say, no, that is Syrian territory that is illegally occupied by Israel. They did do it with the West Bank. They maintained the idea that settlements, according to international law, and it was very careful the way administration officials under Biden spoke about it, right? They didn't condemn it or talk about it like it's illegal. They were very careful to say, well, it's not in line with international law, but then again had no policies that would prevent the expansion. And in fact, under the Biden administration, we saw the biggest sort of land grabs in the last several decades in the West Bank. So there's no, what is the difference between these two parties when it comes to Israel policy? Nothing.
And I do want to mention just one quick thing, going back to the question of, has there been any kind of a shift in the news media? Another kind of really, literally like in the last 48, 72 hours, an example that I think is very stark is that when Israel very explicitly, right? It's like undeniable. They've been breaking the ceasefire since, the ceasefire started, but when they very undeniably broke the ceasefire, the immediate coverage, which we see not just in headlines, but even cable news commentary, we see in also the bulk of the reporting itself, is that everything is immediately just an Israeli press release, right? Israel strikes Hamas targets in Gaza. And no one mentioned, I think the first article that I saw was from ABC News, which, by the way, the rest of the article was awful, because it was, again, just an Israeli press release and didn't even mention the word Palestinian once. It just said people were killed. Word Palestinian is not even mentioned once. It just mentions Ministry of Health, doesn't even specify that we're talking about the Gaza Ministry of Health. But that was the first headline that I saw that explicitly stated that Israel had broken the ceasefire. Earlier, there was like CNN reporting in which in the very first paragraph, they had something to the effect of like how Israel doing this puts doubts on an already fragile ceasefire, which is like, come on, right? Because we know that, for instance, had Hamas fired a single bullet, every single headline would be Hamas breaks ceasefire, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's, and then what was it? Less than 24 hours or 48 hours after that, a UN convoy was bombed, right? International aid workers were killed. Where is the outrage in the news media and amongst democratic law? Okay, you don't care about Palestinians. You also don't care about, international aid workers or UN or the UN, either. So this, really stark examples of, again, in media coverage, how so much of this, the outrage when it comes, I think it's so important to look at it not only in the context of the greater scheme of genocide manufacturing, but also like, what is it serving in that moment, right? When we see this outrage, who is it serving? This, again, manufactured outrage, like who is it serving, and what is the political purpose that it's playing and the function that it's playing?
That's honestly a really very powerful testimony to the fact that the journalism that we expect to see from most mainstream outlets is simply abysmal and has been abysmal for the last 17 months. But before diving well into the media, I want to take us back just a little bit to a point that you raised, Assal, about this issue of how the Republican Party or the Trump supporters know exactly what they're getting from that political sort of project, and how the Democrats and Laila and both you and Sana spoke to this as well. But I'm curious, where does polling come into this? Because right now we've got the Democrats performing at some of their lowest approval ratings to date. There's obviously a real fracturing going on within the base. I don't know if they're disoriented or if they know where their base is anymore. There's open discussion about the need to have complete sort of reform / overhaul of the sort of powers within the party itself. We see folks who have been sidelined for the longest time now all of a sudden kind of rising up. We're also seeing polling around favorability of Israel or lack thereof and decline in that regard, and more sort of younger folks taking not only an interest but feeling quite a strong sense of conviction towards Palestinian rights and freedoms. So where does that leave the political establishment within the Democratic Party? Are they out of sync, out of sorts, out of ideas? Are they forced to consider new ways of doing things and abandoning, let's say, like the powerful kind of, APAC style lobbying narratives? Is this where we're starting to see some of those like slightly off the script approaches and things that we're not accustomed to hearing? I get the argument on all three of your parts saying, the establishment is still the establishment. But are there openings in that regard, and are they to be taken seriously if they're willing to take a jab at maybe a potential electoral success in the future? Are they willing to take more risks in this regard? And this is open to anyone. Anyone can speak to that.
I haven't seen any evidence that they're willing to shift. No evidence. Even if you look at the left flank of the party, it took an enormously long time for Bernie Sanders, who so many, pro people in the pro-Palestine movement, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, a very diverse coalition of people who truly felt betrayed by him. They said, I went out, I canvassed for you, I campaigned for you. You made me believe in politics. You had me come out and actually participate in the system. And it took so long for him to actually open his mouth and really condemn what was happening to Palestinians. And I think that's still sitting with people. People haven't forgotten that. It's the same with AOC, who had to be literally chased down the hallways of movie theaters by constituents saying, please say something. She took that infamous selfie with Joe Biden in the midst of the genocide as he was sending more and more weapons transfers to Israel. So I think when you even see the left flank of the party, which is supposed to be the part of the party that really pushes for progress, pushes for change, taking so long to even condemn the genocide, or refusing to use certain words, or endorsing the very president who was responsible for it in Joe Biden and then in Harris, I think that doesn't really inspire confidence that there's a huge shift going on. Of course, we saw AIPAC exert huge influence during this last election in taking down some of the more outspoken and courageous members of Congress, like Cori Bush, like Jamal Bowman, failing with Summer Lee, but that seems to have been the exception. Failing with Rashida, although it doesn't seem like they deployed as many resources to take her down, but we'll see what happens in the next election. But I don't have huge confidence. You also see them kind of outright ignoring polling. So internal polling was showing them that they were in huge trouble in Michigan. They knew that. They had those numbers. The Republicans had those numbers. And what do you see them do? Send Bill Clinton out to tell them that it's Hamas that's forcing Israel to send to kill civilians. You see them send Richie Torres, one of the most pro-Israel members of Congress, to Michigan. They were making one blunder after another. And sometimes it felt like it was intentional, that they were intentionally trying to provoke their own base and their own voters and to offend them. You saw that with Harris shouting people down, saying, I'm speaking, completely disrespectfully. So I personally don't have confidence that they're changing, and that at least on the leadership level.
Thanks, Laila. Any thoughts, Sana or Assal, on this point?
I agree. Everything that Laila said, I agree with her in terms of there is not going to be any kind of a shift on the leadership level. Look, someone like Bernie Sanders, as someone who adored Bernie Sanders since 2015. Right before COVID was official 5 years ago. I went to his rally here in Virginia as well. Like I thought that his vision for this country and his approach at that time, while still Zio, but was still in terms of the occupation, was something that we could work within. And naively so. But even someone like Bernie was talking about Israel's right to defend itself, which he still, of course, does. He spent the first 2 months minimum, I think it was, supporting Israel's campaign, and then saying things like, well, maybe we need a humanitarian corridor, et cetera, right? And so even when you're seeing that, to echo what Laila was saying, it's like, what changed when even the most high-ranking, someone like Sanders, I think, is so important in terms of what him doing this and the impact that has on everyone on the outside watching this, or is kind of part of the base of the party and is more progressive, is that when someone who is responsible for really, right, bringing a certain type of or expounding on a certain type of political consciousness in this country has that type of a position on the genocide early on, completely disenchants people. But also, I do think that the hands of many of the people in both parties, not just the Democrats, will be forced at some point to possibly shift on the engagement with Israel, and not out of some sort of moral consideration, but as we are entering a really awful economic period in this country, right? I mean, Trump's approval ratings are abysmal for someone who has only been in office for what, like 3 months, 2 months, whatever, 2.5 months. They're all, including amongst Republicans. So even though he is doing a lot of the things that a lot of Republicans support, and specifically it's his donors who really support a lot of the policies that he's pushing forward, he doesn't exactly have the hottest approval rating amongst his own supporters as well, and especially when you're so early in your second presidency. I do think that as we get deeper into this incoming recession, as the impact of the dismantling of federal programs and departments starts to reach middle America, right? As it starts to spread, because it takes about 3 to 6 months before we start really reeling from the negative impact of something like, for instance, the defunding of, or like the mass layoffs, for instance, of the Department of Education. People are already kind of talking about the impact, but the full impact we're not really going to begin to see until about 3 to 6 months. When people start seeing this, and then they're seeing again this focus on Israel again and again, the money that's going there, the way that also free speech is being repressed in this country, as you know, which is, it's been interesting to see how even yes, like I think it was Laila who mentioned this. There are people who are like, oh, well, I don't agree with Mahmoud Khalil, but like he still has the right to say it. But it's been interesting to see how many people, whether they write for like the American Conservative or for the Atlantic, who are saying like, we're kind of, wait a second, what are we doing? We're talking about persecuting speech here, right? And I think as that happens more and more, because this administration is not showing any sign of slowing down with regards to persecution of speech. I mean, just yesterday, a French scientist was denied entry into the United States for a conference that he had to attend in Texas because they found texts in his phone that were critical of Trump. And yes, there's a question of like, well, does a French national have, who's visiting, a tourist, does he have, free speech rights? That question aside, it's still a matter of speech, that someone can be denied entry into the country based on their speech. And we know that so much of American exceptionalism, American identity is not just based on the rights enshrined in the Constitution, but specifically in the First Amendment, right? That's always kind of been this unique American claim to its own exceptionalism, is that it is the land of the free and of free speech. So when that comes under threat, I think we're going to see, and we see with Social Security, we see that people are on the right, as well as obviously on like liberals, but all Americans right now absolutely are terrified about what it means, about the possibility of losing Social Security. So I think because of these things, there's going to be even more anger at money and resources and the dissolution of civil rights for another country. I think we are going to see possibly a rhetorical shift, and maybe, I'm not saying it's going to happen by the next 4 years, but I do think that anger is going to reflect, at least on like a more local level. We're going to start seeing that more in the electoral landscape. But that's not going to happen this year, next year, or whenever. But although if they come after Social Security, I think heads will roll, because a lot of Americans, whether they're on the right or the left, are very serious about that. 2/3 of the American elderly are kept out of poverty because of Social Security. And that means if those elderly lose that Social Security because of Elon Musk saying like, we don't need this, we have to cut government overspending, etc. That responsibility of taking care of those elderly falls on their children, in an economy which we see before us slowly but surely collapsing.
Can I jump in with thank you so much, Sana, for this, and Assal and Laila. I'm curious if we think, I mean, it sounds like everything is in a state of complete rapture, which is mind-blowing, because to an extent we're also talking about how media cover exactly those types of transformative moments. On one level, we're starting to see the Republicans, or I should say like the Trump followers, migrating to platforms that are friendly. There's an increased kind of siloing. There's like a right-wing media space sphere world ecosystem that's developing where people kind of go to get that. And then there's sort of like everyone else, right? There's, of course, the legacy mainstream media. And every time we talk about media and journalism, we're really talking about those quote unquote legacy entities. So the question is, to what extent does journalism still sort of matter? And I don't mean matter to public and public interest, but at what point does journalism stop mattering to the political animals that are in this ecosystem, right? Where Trump supporters and the folks that Trump is really communicating with, as well as Elon Musk and others, are in control of those platforms, those spaces, and migrating people to them, and the rest are kind of left to wilt, right? Or does that mean that those media organizations have to reinvent themselves? The legacy media have to reinvent themselves. So I just want to put that out there, and then I'm going to come back with like a little piece of news to help us kind of understand that a bit more.
If we can actually to link that back to the conversation we were having, because I wanted to comment on this sort of, when we're talking about Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and there's a whole historical context that brings us to this current situation we're in. Because as Sana is speaking, what you hear is basically mass dissatisfaction, right? It's that dissatisfaction on the right, dissatisfaction on the left, dissatisfaction in the middle. And this is one of the, I think, frustrations of the way that even the media that you're talking about handles Trump, because they handle him like an anomaly, right? They talk about him like he's some he's some special outlier rather than a consequence of the very system that has created these conditions, not overnight, but over decades, right? The current conditions that we exist in, the mass wealth inequality, the fact that so many Americans, I mean, Sana was talking about how money is going to Israel. Think about Ukraine. Think about the fact that Ukraine was something that, and it fits so well into sort of the Cold War, old generation way of thinking of things. Russia's the bad guy. And yet you saw Americans very, very supportive rhetorically of Ukraine, but not really wanting all of this money to go to Ukraine. And what explains that is precisely what Sana was talking about. It's this idea that, well, Americans are struggling at home. Why are their resources being used in this way? And that's where something like Elon Musk and Doge fit in. What's appealing to people is to hear, oh, yeah, well, why are we spending money on this? And why are we spending money on that? Because we're struggling at home. What they're not understanding is that none of those cuts are going to be redistributed to them, and that those cuts are actually undermining so many of the things, that access to material things that they actually do need, and the things that are not being cut, those are the things we don't need, right? We talk about foreign aid being cut. Guess who was the exception? Israel. So I do think that there's going to be a certain level of frustration over time, because Trump is supposed to be an anti-establishment politician. That's what made him successful, is that he was saying there's something wrong with the establishment. In terms of your question about the media, I don't know. I think that there's always, there are always echo chambers, even without social media, even without, there's always a way where people, if you're with people in a certain circle, then that creates its own echo chamber before you had social media. But I still think the role of the legacy media is very important in how it passively shapes the way that people think about things.
Thank you, Assal. Anybody else want to speak to this? Or I'm happy to offer some really interesting revelations about the legacy media. I think.
Well, I was just going to jump in and say, I think one of the unfortunate realities we're in is the fact that, the legacy media does tend to have more sway over democratic administrations, but they tend to exercise that less. And then they tend to have a lot less sway over Republican administrations and then exercise that a lot more. So in places where, democratic administrations tend to be a lot more, I would say, receptive to some mainstream media coverage, but then you see overall kind of an ideological alignment. Obviously there's exceptions, but especially when it comes to foreign policy between these mainstream institutions and democratic administrations. So you don't really see that pushback as much, that speaking truth to power, that holding power to account. You see that a lot more with when Republicans are in the White House, as we've talked about, but then Republicans don't really care about those outlets because they don't see them as being really there their people or their constituents. We've heard Trump for years call the mainstream media the enemy of the people. The other thing is, even though media is becoming much more siloed and has been for many years, on the right, you don't see as much like reporting as you do kind of in these mainstream media institutions, setting aside, of course, Palestine, Israel, because we know that's more stenography than reporting. We've covered how they've reported on the resumption of Israel's kind of widespread and large-scale bombing of Gaza, which is basically stenography from the Israeli military claims. But even as the media gets siloed, I don't necessarily see mainstream media totally disappearing. I still see a role for it, and an importance in kind of pushing them to do better, especially on these issues we've talked about.
I'm just going to quickly echo everything that's been said, and also just like, I don't think the mainstream media, as much as there, I mean, before even the genocide in Gaza started, Gaza and the West Bank, we should say, but like before that even started, I think in 2022 or late 2020, I'm trying to remember the exact year when it was, but like American confidence in the news media overall was at like 34%, which is the lowest it's ever been historically. I haven't looked into any recent polls, but I can't imagine it being higher than that, or, you know, but that being said, you know, U.S. news media plays such an important function in the dissemination of American power, again, in the form of domestic policy and foreign policy. We also know that the people who are consuming legacy media are people who are also older voters. The people who actually also, we know, will go out, they're overrepresented in the polls versus in the polls when it comes to federal elections than younger voters. Younger voters, younger Americans are turning towards alternative media, right? So there is, yes, that shift. Now, what is traditional American media going to look like? Mainstream news, you know, what is CNN? What is MSNBC? What are they going to look like in the next, not even 3 to 4 years, but 5, 6, 7, 10 years? I have no idea. I think like with this country, culturally, politically, is such a crapshoot right now that it's like, I think anyone saying that they know what things are going to look like even in the next year is basically trying to get a podcast with the New York Times. You know what I mean? Like it's not going or with Pod Save America. That's where they're trying to get a podcast. But I do think that the most critical role our news media plays, and of course, like there are incredible media critics who've written about this, whether it's Noam Chomsky, Michael Parenti, Richard Falk as well, right? Who've written about the very specific political role of our news media, which is, again, to disseminate and manufacture consent for policies, both domestic and international and foreign, so that again, American machinery of violence, whether through the prison system here, incarceration, whether through the way it treats issues of healthcare, homelessness, or anything regarding its foreign policy, keeps going as well. So it's very relevant to those in power. And one thing I do also want to mention is that as much as Trump relies on and has this, there's an incredible ecosystem of right-wing news media. Like, it's really incredible when you get into it, how it built upon itself. Also, the history of it over the last just 7-8 years alone, if we were to look at it. Because about 10 years ago, when we talked about right-wing media, we were talking about Fox News, right? Now, there's like as it's been mentioned, there's an entire ecosystem. But Trump would not be who he is right now. I mean, I'm not even going to talk about his like cultural power in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, but Trump would not be even president, I would argue, were it not for, he barely spent any money in 2015, 2016 on ads because he received so much media coverage. He received $6 billion worth of media coverage that was essentially free political advertising. Right? So that is still relevant even today because a lot of people, I feel like, especially when they have a distrust in the media, when they also look at, and this is why media literacy is so important, they look at how even liberal media news organizations are treating Trump, and they see, well, okay, if our news media is wrong about ABCD, and they're right that the news media is wrong about ABCD, maybe they're also wrong about Trump. So even then, it ends up helping Trump, even if he's not directly feeding into or supporting, as we know, they've been trying to repress access to the White House, to certain media organizations, it still ends up playing right into their hand.
I think that's a really good point, because it's sort of how conspiracy theories work, right? Conspiracy theories work because there's kernels of truth within them. It's not nothing. It's not coming out of thin air. There's enough truth mixed in that it creates the plausibility of this like alternative theory, whatever it might be. And so that's sort of the way that the media, to your point, operates too. It's because there's so many examples. I mean, when you talk about distrust, you're talking about distrust in the media, but that distrust is across the board on all institutions. Again, this is what brings someone like Trump into a position of leadership, because, you know, in theory, he's anti-establishment. And in some ways, that's, again, true. In some ways, he is. I mean, he doesn't care about political norms, decorum, the same kind of like order, or essentially what we're used to. At the same time, when it comes to how he generally operates, which is based on money and power, that's very establishment. That's very status quo. And so in that sense, he maintains that kind of elitist power structure. It's not meant for the working class in any way. But that distrust, I mean, is so interesting if you look at the case of COVID. Why did the U.S. respond to COVID in the way that we did, even though we had like the most vaccines, we had the most access to material means, and whatever we needed essentially to make it through a pandemic better than any other country in the world, and yet we did a terrible job in dealing with it. It's in part because nobody trusts any of these institutions, because they don't trust the government and any of the institutions that back them, and they see the media as part of that because the media parrots it. And coming back full circle to Gaza, part of that breakdown was how much both Biden officials and the media were just gaslighting the public constantly, as if people did not have eyes and ears. Like, it was unbelievable, the situation that you were looking at. Just constant footage of children being slaughtered and people basically telling you, don't believe that. And so I think that is the culmination. Again, it's not what created the distrust, but it is a culmination, and it's sort of emblematic of how these institutions have played out in a way that has created that distrust. And now you have sort of right-wing media and political discourse that has been able to tap into that in order to galvanize their own cause.
I have a question on the some of the tactics that the Trump administration is using, the shock and awe tactics to set the news agenda. Some say that this is actually being done, and how this disorients journalists and publics. And the question is, how might this impact the way we follow news or understand the world around us? And feel free to comment on any aspect of this and add your own.
I think it was Steve Bannon who called it flooding the zone, and it's just overwhelming you with so many different developments that people just freeze and kind of tune out. And I think it's important that people push back against it. It felt like during the first Trump administration, there was sort of this energy, this resurgence of news, of people really wanting to do something, subscribing, whatever it is. I agree with Assal, actually, that I think mainstream news organizations don't want to wrestle or reckon with the fact that their credibility has been so hit in terms of their coverage of Israeli war crimes in Gaza, in terms of their coverage of the genocide, especially among young audiences, in the same way that so many other institutions' credibility has been destroyed. That's not a reckoning they're willing to have. I think they've done a great job. And I think that it's what you see now, 8 years after Trump's first election, is a certain resignation that people have, whether it's political opposition, whether it's the news media, whether it's just regular people who say, like, I want to go to brunch, I want to live my life. If this policy isn't affecting me, I'm not really going to tune in. I've heard from so many people that they have news fatigue, that the news is just too depressing. They're not interested in following it. And I think that's the exact wrong, reaction to take right now. People need to be tuned in. What's happening in Gaza continues to happen with our tax dollars, with our country's direct involvement and facilitation. And despite how horrifying the images are that we've talked about in this conversation that we see on our phones, we have to remain in tune with what's happening. We have to keep following it. It's the very least we can do, is to just bear witness as much as we can to what's happening and to push back. I also feel like there's tremendous fear right now based on the Trump administration really going after student activists, even professors who haven't even been involved in activism, people on kind of vulnerable visas. And I'm hearing people even within my own circles saying, listen, don't post online, just lay low, be quiet. They're not going to stop with these cases. And I think that's exactly how authoritarian regimes thrive. They thrive on people's fear and silence. And that's really what they're counting on, is for people to be cowed into silence on Gaza, on what our own tax money is doing.
Bassam, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Let me jump to another question, and we're going to, be sort of winding down. So I appreciate, each of you addressing it a bit quickly, and that is the very important question at this point, which is how is or are the detentions and deportations of pro-Palestinian activists shifting the Democratic Party's expressions on civil liberties generally and on Palestine specifically, given where supposedly they stand in general and where they stand vis-a-vis Trump? And how is it being covered? I also asked this with the background in mind of the Netflix show Mo, featuring the Palestinian actor and comedian Muhammad Amir, who himself was deported in the series.
Nobody wants to take the question. I can start. Well, in terms
So
of
we can be silent and just let people think about it. It's up to you. You can chime in.
I would say in terms of the response, what's interesting is you've actually seen some response on the right? Like there's been a very, like, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, was it Ann Coulter who actually said, like, you know, isn't this a free speech issue? There's some whimperings on the right because they're supposed to be the free speech warriors, right? The liberals are the snowflakes, and they're the ones who want to repress speech and not let everybody talk. And now you're seeing, and I think Sana spoke to this earlier, and it's so important. I hate saying this because I feel like it takes away from the idea that we are talking about genocide in Gaza, right? The worst thing that you could possibly do to human beings, the thing that, the entire world order that we talk about in the West was built in the wake of a genocide, right? The Holocaust and World War II. So that occurring out in the open for everyone to see, paid for with the weapons of the United States and all the other Western powers completely supporting it, like that should be enough for us to be organized and realize that that is an issue in and of itself. But I think there's all these other implications that slowly maybe people are starting to get, and they should have gotten it because those criticisms existed before. I remember having these conversations a year and a half ago, saying, "Hey, they're not going to stop here. Once you allow this, once you've allowed the worst crime that can possibly exist, it's not like all of a sudden you're going to apply rules anymore. Like, if you think that this way of organizing society is in any way meaningful, then even if you don't care that Palestinians are being slaughtered for whatever reason, you should selfishly care that those systems that you think are important are also being eroded and destroyed in the process." And so when you look at this, it's interesting that I still don't see a democratic, like the Democrats reacting to it in any particular way that I would think they should. And if anything, I've seen more, not more, but I would say I've seen an equal kind of criticism of it in conservative right-wing circles, as well as, I won't call it left, but we'll say democratic liberal circles, right? It's not like one side is coming out and speaking out against it, because it is a massive issue. I mean, when they say it's a slippery slope, it's a really slippery slope. You know, there's what Laila was talking about, this idea of when you're talking in your own circles. I get that too. People say, like, maybe you shouldn't post as much, or maybe you shouldn't say this. And my response is always, I'm pretty sure that ship has sailed. I think my not posting now is not going to affect what anybody's going to think about or evaluate me. But that idea of protection, when you look at a case like Mahmoud Khalil, the reason why it's so terrifying, I'm just going to use that word because that's what it is that the rhetoric of sort of illegal immigration, right, that clearly is not the issue. And this is another mask off moment, as if we haven't had enough of those recently. But you have another moment where the reality of, it's not the legality of immigrants that you care about. It's who the immigrants are. It's what their opinions are. Does it fit into our mainstream establishment politics? And if it doesn't, then we take issue with that. And that's why the example of a French researcher, right? It's about what he's saying. Why is he being critical of, the president of the United States? Well, because he probably thought he's allowed to be. And that's what should be concerning. And if there's any, I think, space for, not amongst the parties, not amongst the political elites, but amongst people, at least, to say, we should all be very worried about what direction we're going in. Maybe that's something that we can find some kind of unity on. But in terms of your question of how the Democrats responded to deportations, I would say exactly what we've been saying this entire hour. They haven't responded. They certainly haven't responded in a way that is even mildly appropriate or meeting the urgency of the moment.
I'll jump in here, and then Laila, you can have the last word about it. Yeah, definitely. I mean, everything Assal just said, but also I think it's also like the Democrats are not going to do anything. There is no salvation in the Democratic Party, including for the most hardcore Democratic base members as well. There is no salvation in that party. I mean, one of the most egregious examples of federal persecution of free speech happened under a Democratic. It happened in 2012 with the Obama administration. It was of Tariq Mahanna, right? I'm not going to get into that case because it's long context and stuff, but there's a lot of stuff available online. But that case, when you read into it, is purely speech persecution of an Arab Muslim man. That was speech that was considered unsavory, and he was persecuted and prosecuted by the federal government. And I think that's also just such an important context to remember. Like, Mahmoud Khalil is not actually an anomaly when we look at especially the last 20 years of American history. There was a great article that came out today in Mondo Weiss by Habib Jamal, in which she talks about the history specifically of state-led persecution and prosecution of Palestinian speech since 2001. And she goes through several examples. And like, there's so many, whether it's the Holy Land Five, Tariq Mahanna, et cetera. There's so many. Also BDS laws across the state, which starts in like 2011 and 12, we start seeing, or anti-Sharia laws as well, right? In 2012 and 13, we see anti-Sharia law. The speech of those who have always been, and especially in the last 20 years, since the creation and proliferation of the war on terror of Arabs and Muslims, has always been given a different treatment. Mahmoud Khalil is an inflection point in that. It is not an anomaly. It is something, and the Democrats have had nothing to say about the speech of Arabs and Muslims over the last 20 years, and because they've been a part of that repression, and they're certainly not really going to do much right now, because even now, the things that they're saying, I believe it was Laila who mentioned earlier, they'll say things like, oh, it's so, like, his speech is gross. I don't agree with it, even though they don't specify anything. They don't specify anything whatsoever about what he has said, but they'll condemn him anyways, and then be like, however, maybe he should. But because when you're doing that, when you're condemning someone for also speech that, again, has not been clarified, which shouldn't even matter, you are also criminalizing them. So what the Democrats are doing in this moment, the ones who are speaking up, they condemn him, but still say, well, he still has a right to free speech, and this is clearly government overreach, et cetera. Well, it doesn't really matter because you've already criminalized him. You've admitted that this guy is a quote unquote bad guy. And not just him, but also now we have so many other cases coming in. Just on Monday, there was a Georgetown researcher, Badr Khan Suri, who was also picked up by DHS and is now sitting in ICE detention. And not even for his own speech was he was accused of basically the fact that his Palestinian American wife, right, about her father being a former advisor to Ismail Haniyeh, I believe, and then also the fact that she maybe worked at Al Jazeera at some point, which to me, we're entering even scarier territory, which is that it's only a matter of time. They start with the academics and the students, and that reach then starts going into also journalists and others as well. And no one is going to be safe. Like this idea that anyone is going to be protected from that, including maybe those who support, this administration, no one is going to be safe. I'll say this again, right? Like the Democrats are doing exactly what they have always done, which is they allow the Republicans to run amok. They allow the Republicans to do all of this, and they just sit back and use it to fundraise and fearmonger. And I think what they're not realizing in this book, because they could be doing something. There's clearly DHS overreach. We're seeing people being arrested, put into ICE detention, who are permanent, also legal residents. Although I don't think someone's obviously like due process should matter whether you're here without documentation or with documentation. I don't think that like your documentation should matter when it comes to due process. But there's clearly DHS overreach here. There's clearly processes. There's laws that are being broken. What are the Democrats doing to protect any of that? They love to talk about, Trump, fascism, authoritarianism, the complete breaking of the law and this. Okay, so what are you doing about it? What are you introducing? Any kind of motions of impeachment or anything, or requesting, a judicial review of DHS? Anything of this? I haven't seen anything yet. And they're not moving at all, which to me just says exactly as I just said. Like they I think ultimately love these things because for them, it's how they make money, it's how they fundraise, and it's how they keep themselves relevant. But I do think they're maybe, unfortunately, they have not learned anything from the last election, unsurprisingly, and are not realizing how they're shooting themselves in the foot.
We are running up to the end of our time, and Adel had something to say. I think. Would you like to share, Adel? And then I'll try to close with a very quick, like not yes or no, but a very quick question for all of you on the theme of the long form podcast.
I mean, in light of what we've discussed thus far, I just wanted to note that in the 86th Annual Overseas Press Club Awards, which gives awards, it's an awards ceremony for the best journalism. This year, in the last couple of days, we learned that Gaza was a huge component in the award ceremony, and I wanted to acknowledge the presence of Laila here, who's the recipient of two major awards for work that you've done, Laila. Congratulations, and especially on some of the work on Gaza. But one of the interesting things here, in light of what we discussed about legacy in mainstream media, is that Gaza was a very, very big topic among a lot of the recipients. One thing that will shock probably Assal more so than everybody else is that somehow the New York Times also came out on top, and also for their Gaza coverage. So that's a very unusual thing. So I just wanted to maybe acknowledge the fact that while we're discussing this at a moment where maybe there is sort of a barometer or kind of a litmus testing where, legacy media, or I shouldn't say legacy, but legacy kind of describes their political economic kind of structure and their history, but rather mainstream media continues to be a purveyor of journalistic principles, offering context, doing long form, not unlike the conversation that we're having today, and that everybody here has participated in contributing to that. And so receiving awards, I hope, is at least some protection against what we are looking at today. And while we can't guarantee that, we can't guarantee anything, but nevertheless, we know where quality lies, and quality lies in justice-driven, public, interest-driven work and reporting. And at least there's some entities out there that can recognize the work for what it is. But perhaps the New York Times shouldn't be given as much credit as they have in these types of circumstances. I just wanted to express gratitude to all of you for the work that you do and for your discussions today.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Adam.
and thank you, and of course, same here. And I have to also express gratitude to Adel for joining me as co-moderator, because he was supposed to be a speaker. And so thanks, Adel. We will have our own conversation with you on these matters where you can opine. But before we close, we have literally like 3 minutes. And I wanted to say or ask, I understand that we always, for the past, and I'm probably the oldest person here, I've been watching this since the late 70s and early 1980s, when I was, under the Israeli invasion in 1982 in Beirut, that, oh, is this going to change things? My question, or our question at long form, is this particular genocide, which comes up at a particular moment, but 17 years or 16 years after the stock market crash in 2008, which is a very important juncture, and the sort of the exposing of the duplicity of what is called Western values, and so on and so forth. And this is reflected everywhere, and change doesn't happen overnight. Do you see, in very short form, not long form, do you see any rays of light? Not right now. I personally don't see anything right now. I see genocide. But do you see this in the ripple effect across time going forward? Do you see any rays of light in terms of a kind of self-awareness that we did not have prior, in terms of media reporting, but also in general?
I think there's no doubt that as problematic and as consequential and really key to enabling the genocide as the media coverage has been, that there are some rays of light even within the media coverage, that there have been attempts to investigate war crimes, shine a light on what Israel's doing to Palestinians in Gaza and has been doing for over a year and a half now. So I do think there are rays of light, and I think what sustains human beings is some semblance of hope. You even see that in people on the ground in Gaza, that they have hope that things will be better. They have hope that there'll be another day. And I think if they can have that hope, so can we. The other day, I took my kids to get a haircut, and the woman cutting their hair was from Vietnam. And when she found out that I was Palestinian, she said, I hope that you all get your liberation and freedom just like we did. And I think it's important also to ground ourselves in other struggles and to understand that it takes time and it's not easy. And, it will be a long road and a journey, but that hope is what we need at these times.
Assal and Sana, if you can opine as we close.
I was going to say I think that's the best note to end on, but
Okay. I mean,
I'm happy to hand it to Sana if you've something you wanted to add. But I think that summed it up.
I mean, nothing's automatic. And as I kept hearing for decades, and I now keep saying, there's no substitution or no substitute to organizing, because nothing is going to happen automatically. Even those rays of light will not just shine on their own. So, and we see this happening. But I also see a dramatic difference, like beyond dramatic, between the 1980s and how we talk about Palestine and today. And I think the backlash, including the genocidal backlash that we're seeing, as horrible as it is also a reflection of how far things have come in terms of being able to speak about the question of Palestine. The mention of the word apartheid today is almost mainstream. You can agree with it, you can disagree with it, or people can agree or disagree with it, but this was not even an option, you see, just maybe 15, 20 years ago, let alone 2 or 3 or 4 decades ago. So this is why I'm asking when we're asking these questions, and the question about international law and so on. There's also a kind of a domestic in the United States, at least, uh, uh, dissatisfaction of a certain profound kind that did not exist prior. The belief in the market is not what it was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, and so on and so forth, as a solution to everything, and so on. And thanks to Trump, he's going to make sure that this actually proceeds at a much faster pace. This sort of this you know this sort of dissatisfaction, let's put it at that, so that we don't overstate the situation. Well, I can't thank you all enough, Sana and Asal and Layla and of course Adil. We hope to continue speaking. I keep telling you this, that we hope to continue speaking. It looks like we will, because the wheels of genocide have actually ramped up again. They never stopped. They moved to the West Bank, and then they're back in full force in very intense ways. And thank you for joining us and sharing your time. I know this is a difficult time to speak on anything, and we're all tired and exhausted and kind of not interested in speaking anymore. We've been saying the same things for 17 months. So shukran. Thank you. Thanks to all.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So that went really well, Adil. I wish we had more time. I mean, it was just impossible to cover everything.
I know there's so much going on. The news cycle is crazy. There's so much unfolding between here in here in North America, U.S., Canada, everywhere, Gaza, Palestine, West Bank. So it's just so much to cover. And then of course we've got three spectacular speakers, each with a wealth of experience and knowledge about the subject matter. Award recipients. I mean, we had to announce Layla's awards today, the Peter Jennings Award as well as others. So it's very difficult to cover all that territory and space, but it was a really magnificent conversation and the beginning of
Abs-
many, I hope.
Absolutely. And I hope we are able to speak with them maybe even separately, because there are so many strands that each person could have gone in. And of course, I would love to feature you. Maybe Muin and I can نستفلد فيك, as we say in Arabic, one
يا
day
ريت والله.
long form. You can't like it so much. طيب, thank you, Adel, for joining me. You enriched the conversation in ways that I can't as a media guru. So
It's
shukran.
a real pleasure. It's impossible to fill Maureen's shoes. He wears like Shaquille O'Neal size shoes, but I tried my best.
Actually, he doesn't. طيب, salam alaikum. Bye,
Thank you.
Habib. Salam. Bye.
Bonsoir.